The millionaire was meant to die in the car crash, but the woman who saved him changed everything. Hi, my beautiful family. Thank you for sticking around with me through our trying times. That I really appreciate your love and support. We're finally back again to give you many more beautiful stories. If you're already hooked in for today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The taste of blood in my mouth was the first good thing I'd felt in 5 years. It meant the plan had worked. Peace. Finally. But my perfect, quiet ending was interrupted by a stupidly hopeful voice from somewhere outside the wreck. "I'm here to help," she yelled. She didn't understand. She wasn't help. She was a complication. Now let's dive deep. The city of glass and steel looked like a circuit board from Julian Croft's penthouse on the 82nd floor. A sprawling, indifferent network of light and energy, and he was its master. Below, millions of lives hummed along. People loving, fighting, dreaming, and dying. From up here, they were just silent, flowing data. Insignificant. It was a perspective he had cultivated with the same ruthless precision he applied to his portfolio. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling window, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. The ice clinked, a sharp, lonely sound in the cavernous silence of the living room. Everything was chrome, black leather, and polished marble. It wasn't a home, it was a statement. A fortress against the messiness of human emotion. The only warmth in the entire space came from the muted glow of the stock ticker, scrolling across a discrete screen on the far wall. Green. It was always green. His phone buzzed on the granite countertop. He glanced at the name, Gerard. His right-hand man. He ignored it. The deal was done. He'd just spent 6 hours systematically dismantling a rival company, absorbing their assets, and rendering a decade of someone else's work obsolete. He'd done it without raising his voice, without a flicker of remorse. He'd felt nothing but the cold, clean satisfaction of a problem solved. It was the same feeling he got from completing a complex equation. He took a sip of the ridiculously expensive scotch. It tasted of smoke and peat and hollow victory. He had 1,000 contacts in his phone, but not one he could call to share the win. Share? The concept was foreign. You didn't share victory, you consumed it. His gaze drifted to a single framed photograph on his otherwise sterile desk. It was the only personal item in the entire penthouse, and he hated himself for keeping it. A woman with a radiant, uninhibited laugh, and a little girl with bright, curious eyes, her hand clasped in his. It was from another life, another Julian. A weaker Julian. He hadn't looked at it in months, but tonight, its presence felt like a physical weight in the room. Tonight was the anniversary. 5 years. 5 years since the circuit board of his own life had shorted out, leaving nothing but the cold, humming machinery of his ambition. The phone buzzed again. Gerard. Persistent. Julian finally answered, his voice flat. What? Julian. Monumental. The board is ecstatic. They're calling it a masterstroke. Gerard's voice was slick with the sycophantic adrenaline of a win he hadn't earned. It was a simple acquisition, Gerard. Don't wet yourself. A nervous chuckle from the other end. Of course. Right. So, the celebration dinner at Aurelia is set for 9. Everyone will be there. Julian looked out the window again, at the endless, impersonal lights. A performance. He'd have to shake hands, accept congratulations, and pretend he was one of them. Pretend he felt anything at all. The thought was exhausting. I'm not coming. Not coming. Julian, this is your victory lap. My victory lap will be a 12-hour flight to the Tokyo office in the morning. Cancel the dinner. He didn't wait for a reply, ending the call and placing the phone face down. The silence that rushed back in was heavier this time. It was a living thing, filled with the ghosts of laughter and conversations he could no longer remember clearly. He finished the scotch in one swallow, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction. He walked to the bar, intending to pour another, but his hand stopped. What was the point? The numbness was already absolute. He glanced at the keys to his Veyron sitting in a black lacquer bowl. A car that could go from 0 to 100 in the time it took to draw a breath. A machine of pure, unadulterated escape. He hadn't driven it in a year. Tonight, however, the thought of it called to him. Not the speed. The finality. The coastal highway. The cliffs at Mariner's Point. The storm warnings he'd seen on the news earlier. It all clicked into place in his mind with the cold, clean logic of a business decision. An elegant, efficient solution to a problem that had lingered for 5 years too long. He picked up the keys. The metal was cold, solid. He felt nothing. And that was the answer. 200 miles away, the wind was a living thing, a wild beast throwing itself against Lena Petrova's small cottage. It howled through the gnarled cypress trees and rattled the window panes in their frames. To an outsider, it would have been terrifying. To Lena, it was music. The world was washing itself clean. Her cottage was the antithesis of Julian's penthouse. It was small, cluttered, and brimming with life. Canvases in various stages of completion leaned against every wall, their vibrant colors a defiant challenge to the gray, churning sea outside. The air smelled of turpentine, damp earth, and the wood smoke crackling in the cast-iron stove that was the cottage's heart. Lena stood before a large canvas, her bare feet planted on the paint-splattered wooden floor. A smudge of cobalt blue was smeared across her cheek, and her brow was furrowed in concentration. She wasn't painting the storm. She was painting the feeling of it, the raw power, the beautiful chaos, the sense of something ancient and untamable. Her hands moved with a focused energy, dabbing, smearing, scratching at the paint with her palette knife. This was her language, the only one that ever felt completely true. She had bought this place, a glorified fishing shack, really, 7 years ago with the last of her inheritance. She had run away from a city that felt too loud, a life that felt too performative, and people who only saw her as the quiet, artistic daughter of a well-to-do family. Here, she was just Lena. Here, her solitude wasn't a sign of failure. It was a choice. A sanctuary. Her cat, a scruffy ginger Tom named Whistler, rubbed against her leg, purring like a tiny engine. She smiled, reaching down to scratch him behind the ears. You hear that, Whisk? The world is having a tantrum. The cottage was her fortress, but unlike Julian's, it wasn't designed to keep the world out. It was designed to let the right parts of it in. The sound of the waves, the salt in the air, the cry of the gulls. She sold just enough of her paintings online to a small, loyal group of collectors to pay her bills. It was a simple life, a quiet one. And sometimes, in the dead of night when the wind was still, it was a lonely one. But it was real. A particularly violent gust of wind slammed a sheet of rain against the sea-facing window. Whistler jumped. Lena looked out into the churning blackness. The coastal road that snaked along the cliffs was barely visible, a treacherous ribbon of asphalt slick with rain. It was a dangerous road on a clear day. Tonight, it was a death trap. No one would be foolish enough to be out there. She turned back to her canvas, but the feeling was gone. A strange unease had settled over her, a quiet hum of anxiety beneath the storm's roar. It was a feeling she'd learned to trust. She put down her knife and walked to the window, peering out again into the impenetrable dark. The headlights of a car sliced through the rain, moving far too fast. They weren't the familiar beams of a local's pickup truck. They were sharp, white, aggressive. Alien. What idiot is out there driving like that? She murmured to herself. She watched the lights weave along the serpentine road, getting closer to the sharpest turn, the one the locals called the Widow's Leap. She held her breath, a silent, foolish plea forming in her mind. Slow down. Please just slow down. The lights didn't slow. They accelerated. Then, they swerved violently and disappeared. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the wind and the rain. Then came a sound that ripped through the storm's symphony. The horrific, gut-wrenching shriek of metal tearing itself apart. It was a sound of absolute finality. Lena stood frozen for a second, her heart hammering against her ribs. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. She grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight she kept by the door and her thickest rain slicker. Stay here, she ordered the cat, her voice tight with adrenaline. As she pulled open the door, the wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it back against the wall. The storm screamed in her ears. Every rational thought told her to stay inside, to call for help. But the phone lines always went down in these storms, and the nearest neighbor was 2 miles away. Help wouldn't come. Not for hours. Out there, in the dark, someone's world had just ended. And she was the only one who knew. Pulling the hood over her head, Lena stepped out into the raging chaos. We all have moments where we feel like running away from our lives, either into a storm or into our work. What's your go-to escape, and do you think it helps or hurts in the long run? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The path from Lena's cottage to the road was less a path, and more a suggestion carved into the hillside, a muddy channel of slippery rock and stubborn roots. In summer, it was a charming rustic trail. In this storm, it was a treacherous tributary of rushing water. The wind fought her with the force of a physical opponent, trying to wrench the flashlight from her hand and push her back toward the safety of her home. Every step was a calculated risk, her boots sinking into the grasping mud. The roar of the ocean below the cliffs was a constant, hungry threat. She kept her light trained on the ground, scanning for the dark gash in the landscape where the car must have gone through. She found it 50 yards from the bend. The guardrail, a series of thick wooden posts linked by steel cable, had been obliterated. Splintered, raw wood pointed accusingly into the abyss. The cables snapped and coiled like dead serpents. It wasn't an accident. No one accidentally hit a guardrail with that much force. It was an impact of pure, savage intent. Her beam cut through the driving rain, sweeping across the dark space below the road. And there it was. The vehicle was wedged nose down in a crevice between two massive slate-grey boulders, about 30 feet below the road. It looked like a wounded insect, a creature of impossible angles and crushed geometry. It was a car of a make and model she didn't recognize, all sleek, aerodynamic lines and metallic sheen, now crumpled like a discarded piece of foil. Steam hissed from the mangled hood, a ghostly white plume dissolving instantly in the downpour. It was a miracle the thing hadn't exploded or tumbled the rest of the way into the churning surf below. "Hello." Her voice was thin, snatched away by the wind almost before it left her lips. "Is anyone there?" Only the storm answered. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at the edges of her resolve. He was probably dead. Of course he was dead. No one could survive that. She should go back, wait for the storm to pass, and call the authorities. It was the sensible thing to do. The safe thing to do. But the image of those headlights, accelerating into the turn, flashed in her mind. It wasn't just an accident. It felt like a choice. And the thought of someone dying alone in the dark, having made that choice, was something she couldn't stomach. With a deep breath that tasted of rain and ozone, she began the perilous climb down. It was more a controlled slide than a climb, her hands grabbing at wet gorse and sharp-edged rock to slow her descent. The mud and shale slid under her feet, and twice she almost lost her footing, sending a cascade of small stones clattering down into the darkness. Finally, her boots hit a solid flat surface, the top of one of the boulders that cradled the car. The wreckage was even more horrific up close. The driver's side had taken the brunt of the impact, the door folded inward on itself like a piece of paper. The windshield was a mosaic of a million tiny fractures, and the silence from within was absolute. Lena's heart sank. She was too late. Still, she had to be sure. She braced herself against the rock and leaned precariously over the car, shining her flashlight through the shattered passenger side window. The interior was a disaster zone of deployed airbags, shattered glass, and the faint, coppery smell of blood mixed with the sterile scent of new leather. And in the driver's seat, slumped against the steering wheel, was a man. He was wearing a dark, impeccably tailored suit, now ruined, soaked with rain and something darker. His head was bowed, a gash on his temple painting a crimson streak through his dark hair. His face was turned away from her, and he was terrifyingly still. "Sir," she called, her voice trembling slightly. "Sir, can you hear me?" Nothing. A profound sadness washed over her. The sheer, wasteful violence of it. This man, in his expensive suit and his state-of-the-art car, had met his end on her doorstep. She was about to pull back, to accept the finality of it, when she saw it. A slight, almost imperceptible tremor in his hand, which lay palm up on the passenger seat. Hope, fierce and sudden, surged through her. "You're alive," she whispered, the words of prayer. She scrambled around the front of the car, her flashlight beam dancing over the buckled hood. She had to get to him. The driver's door was a lost cause, jammed and bent into the frame. The passenger door was her only chance. It was dented but seemed structurally intact. She grabbed the handle, her fingers numb with cold, and pulled. It was stuck. She braced her feet against the rock and pulled again, with all her weight, her muscles screaming in protest. With a groan of tortured metal, the door gave way, swinging open a few precious inches. It was enough. She squeezed through the gap, her rein slicker catching on a shard of metal. The interior of the car felt claustrophobic, a tomb. She was now inches from him. She reached out a hesitant hand, placing 2 fingers on his neck, searching for a pulse. She found it. Faint, thready, but undeniably there. "Okay," she said, as much to herself as to him. "Okay. You're alive. I'm going to get you out of here." As if her voice had pierced through a deep fog, he stirred. His head lifted slowly, a movement that seemed to cost him an immense effort. He turned to face her, and in that moment the world stopped. The storm, the wreck, the pain, it all dissolved into a muted background hum. His eyes, when they met hers, were not filled with the panic or agony she expected. They were a startlingly clear, deep shade of grey, and they held an expression of such profound, soul-deep shock that it stole her breath. It wasn't the shock of the crash. It was the shock of being seen, of being found. In their depths, she saw a vast, desolate landscape of loneliness, a weariness so complete it bordered on surrender. He had been waiting for the end. He had not been waiting for her. For Julian, the pain was a distant, roaring ocean. He'd been floating in a warm, dark void, the final silence he had so carefully engineered. He had felt the impact, the shattering of bone and steel, and had welcomed the encroaching darkness as a release. It was over. The thought had brought a peace he hadn't felt in 5 years. But then a voice. A woman's voice, cutting through the static. He fought against it, wanting the peace to claim him fully. But the voice was persistent, and then there was a touch on his neck, gentle and warm against his cold skin. He forced his eyes open, a lifetime of effort in a single second. The world swam into focus, a kaleidoscope of rain and shattered glass. And then he saw her. A face, framed by a dripping hood, illuminated by the harsh beam of a flashlight. Her eyes were wide, a brilliant, concerned hazel, and in them, he saw not pity or horror, but a raw, startling sincerity. She was looking at him, not at the suit, not at the car, not at the myth of Julian Croft, but at him, the broken man in the wreckage. In that instant, a crack appeared in the fortress he had built around his heart, a fissure so fine he barely registered it, but it was there. Everything he had believed about the transactional, indifferent nature of the world was being challenged by the presence of this one woman, braving a hurricane to save a stranger. His lips parted, but only a dry whisper emerged. No, it wasn't a protest against being saved. It was a protest against the feeling her presence ignited in him. A tiny, long-dormant ember of something he couldn't name. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Lena didn't understand his word. She saw only the immense vulnerability in his gaze. The mask of the powerful man had been shattered along with the car, and what was left was something fragile and achingly human. Her resolve hardened from a duty into a fierce, protective instinct. "Yes," she said, her voice firm now steady. "I'm here. My name is Lena. I'm going to get you out." The spell was broken. The reality of the situation crashed back in. He was injured, pinned. She was his only hope. "My leg," he rasped, the words scraped from his throat. "It's stuck." Lena shone the light down. The dashboard had collapsed, pinning his left leg. She tried to push it, but it wouldn't budge. They didn't have time. The car could shift, or the tide could rise. There was only one way. "We have to get you out now. I need you to work with me. Can you unbuckle your seatbelt?" He nodded, his hand fumbling for the release. It clicked open. "Okay," she said, taking a deep breath. "This is going to hurt. A lot. I'm sorry. On the count of 3, I'm going to pull you, and you're going to use your good leg and your arms to push. Do you understand?" He gave another slow nod, his grey eyes locked on hers, trusting her completely. It was a look that would be seared into her memory. 1, 2, 3. She pulled with a strength she didn't know she possessed. He cried out, a raw, guttural sound of pure agony that was swallowed by the storm. His body moved, sliding across the leather seat, his mangled leg dragging behind him. For a moment, she thought he was free, but he was still caught. He slumped back, his face pale, his eyes fluttering shut. "No, no, no, stay with me," she pleaded, patting his cheek. "Stay with me. We have to go again." His eyes opened, hazy with pain. "I can't." "Yes, you can," she insisted, her voice fierce. "You can. Look at me. We're doing this." His gaze focused on her again. He saw the determination in her face, the rain plastering strands of her brown hair to her skin, the absolute refusal to give up on him. No one had looked at him like that in a very long time. Maybe ever. A spark of his own legendary willpower flickered to life. "Again," he managed to say. They tried again. This time, with a final, sickening wrench of metal and bone, he came free. She half pulled, half dragged him out of the passenger door and onto the relative safety of the boulder. He collapsed against the wet rock, breathing in ragged, painful gasps, a wounded leviathan pulled from the deep. The journey back up the slick, muddy incline was a nightmare. He was a dead weight, leaning heavily on her, his arms slung over her shoulder. He was taller and broader than her, and with every step, her own body screamed. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering things she couldn't understand, other times silent and heavy. She talked to him the entire way, a constant stream of encouragement. "We're almost there. Just a few more feet. Keep breathing. You're doing so well. Finally, dripping, bleeding, and utterly exhausted, they stumbled through the doorway of her cottage. The warm, dry air enveloped them, a stark contrast to the wild chaos outside. The soft light from her lamp fell on walls covered in vibrant, emotional art. The fire in the stove crackled a welcome. Lena gently lowered him onto the rag rug in front of the hearth, propping his head up with a cushion from her worn armchair. He was no longer a name or a suit. He was a collection of injuries and pain, laid bare on her floor. His eyes were closed, his face a mask of suffering, but he was breathing. He was safe. She stood over him, her own body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion, her clothes soaked, her hands scraped and raw. The full reality of the night hit her like a physical blow. The quiet, solitary fortress of her life had been breached. She had gone out into the storm to find a victim, an ending. Instead, she had brought back a man with eyes full of ghosts. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that nothing would ever be the same. The bomb hadn't just landed. It had gone off, and she was standing at the epicenter. The first thing Julian became aware of was the warmth. Not the oppressive, suffocating heat of the mangled car, but a gentle, radiating warmth that seemed to seep into his chilled bones. The second was the smell. Wood smoke, turpentine, and something else, something clean and floral, like dried lavender. It was a scent from a world he didn't inhabit. A world of simple, tangible things. It was disorienting. He forced his eyelids open. They felt impossibly heavy, glued shut by exhaustion and pain. His vision swam, a blur of soft, warm light and unfamiliar shapes. He wasn't in a hospital. There was no sterile white, no rhythmic beeping of machines, no antiseptic smell. He was lying on a soft surface on a wooden floor. His gaze drifted upward, past the edge of a worn, comfortable-looking armchair, to a ceiling with exposed wooden beams. A fire crackled nearby, its dancing light casting long, flickering shadows on walls covered in art. Canvases of all sizes, alive with chaotic, vibrant color. Explosions of feeling rendered in thick strokes of oil paint. He tried to sit up, and a bolt of white-hot agony shot through his left leg. He gasped, falling back with a groan, the world tilting precariously. "Don't move. You'll make it worse." The voice. It was the same one from the storm. The voice that had pulled him from the void. He turned his head, his neck stiff, and saw. She was kneeling beside him, wringing out a cloth in a ceramic bowl of water. Lena. She'd said her name was Lena. She looked different now, out of the storm and in the soft light of her home. Her hair, a warm brown, was still damp, tied back loosely. The smudge of blue paint was still on her cheek, a small, incongruous mark. Her face was etched with concern, but her movements were calm and efficient. She had taken off her heavy rain slicker and was wearing a simple, paint-splattered sweater and jeans. She was real, unadorned. It was unsettling. She had cut away his suit trousers to reveal the damage to his leg. It was a mess of deep contusions, angry purple and swollen, with a nasty, open wound just below the knee where a piece of metal had gouged him. She had cleaned it as best she could, and now she began to gently wrap it with strips of clean cloth, creating a makeshift bandage. The Julian Croft who ran a multi-billion-dollar empire began to reassert himself, pushing aside the broken, vulnerable man from the wreck. The shock was wearing off, replaced by the familiar armor of control and command. This was a situation, a problem, and problems had solutions. Usually, those solutions involved money. "You should have called an ambulance," he said. His voice was rough, a stranger's voice in his own throat. She didn't look up from her task. The storm knocked out the phone lines. "Even if I could call, no ambulance could get up that road until the washout is cleared. You're stuck here." Stuck. The word grated on him. He was never stuck. He moved planets, shifted markets, altered the course of companies with a single phone call. The idea of being trapped in this rustic hovel with this woman was absurd. "Who are you?" he demanded, the question sharper than he intended. She finished tying the bandage, her knot firm and neat. Only then did she meet his gaze. Her hazel eyes were clear, holding no trace of intimidation. "I told you. My name is Lena. I live here. And you just happen to pull strangers from car wrecks in the middle of hurricanes." The cynicism was a reflex, a shield. A faint, wry smile touched her lips. "Only when they're foolish enough to drive off the cliff in front of my house." She stood up, wiping her hands on a towel. "I've done what I can for your leg, but it needs a doctor. It's probably broken. You have a concussion, too, I think. And some bruised ribs, at the very least." She looked him over with a practiced eye. "You're lucky to be alive." "Luck had nothing to do with it," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He remembered the feeling of acceleration, the deliberate turn of the wheel. This wasn't the outcome he'd planned. This strange, gentle purgatory was not the clean, final exit he had designed. It was a complication of the highest order. He pushed himself up on his elbows, ignoring the sharp protest from his ribs. "I need my phone." "It wasn't in the car. It was probably destroyed in the crash," she said simply, walking over to the stove to check on a pot. The last vestige of his control slipped away. No phone. No connection to his world, his power. He was truly cut off. A wave of something akin to panic, an emotion he despised, washed over him. He suppressed it instantly, replacing it with cold, hard currency. It was the only language he trusted. "All right, Lena," he said, his tone shifting into the one he used for negotiations. The one that assumed everyone had a price. "How much?" She turned from the stove, a ladle in her hand, a frown creasing her brow. "How much for what?" "For this. For your trouble." He gestured around the small, cluttered room. "For getting me out of the car, patching me up, the use of your cottage." He said the word as if it tasted foul. "Name a price. I'll have my assistant wire it to you, as soon as the lines are back up. It will be a significant amount. More than you make in a year. In 10 years, probably." He watched her, expecting to see the flicker of greed, the calculation in her eyes. It was a look he knew well. He'd seen it on the faces of rivals, partners, even lovers. It was the universal constant. But he didn't see it. Lena's expression hardened. The warmth in her eyes cooled to a glacial frost. She put the ladle down with a soft clink and walked back over to him, standing so she was looking down at him. Her posture was straight, her chin high. All the gentle compassion she had shown him was gone, replaced by a quiet, formidable anger. "You think you can buy my help?" she asked, her voice dangerously soft. "You think that's what this is? A transaction?" Julian was taken aback by the directness of her fury. It was so unsophisticated. "Everything is a transaction. I had a problem. You provided a service. Now I'm offering compensation. That's how the world works." "Maybe in your world," she countered, her voice ringing with a conviction that filled the small room. "But it's not how it works in mine. I didn't pull you from that wreck because I was expecting a payday. I did it because you were a human being who was hurt and alone. I did it because it was the right thing to do. And the fact that you can't comprehend that, the fact that your first instinct is to throw money at it, as if you're paying for a hotel room, it's pathetic." Pathetic. No one had called Julian Croft pathetic in 3 decades. The word struck a nerve he didn't know he still had. He felt a flush of anger rise in his chest. "I am offering you a life-changing amount of money. A smart person would take it." "Then I guess I'm not smart by your standards," she shot back. "I don't want your money. I don't want anything from you. I just want you to not die on my floor. Is that simple enough for you to understand?" They stared at each other in a standoff, the crackling of the fire the only sound. He, the master of a universe built on leverage and value, was utterly disarmed. His greatest weapon, his wealth, was useless here. It was like trying to threaten the ocean with a briefcase full of cash. She wasn't playing his game. She didn't even acknowledge the board. His resistance hardened into a different form. If he couldn't control her with money, he would control her with disdain. He would retreat into the fortress of his arrogance. "Fine," he said, his voice laced with ice. "Have it your way. Be a martyr. When can I expect to be able to leave this place?" "I told you," she said, her anger receding back into a weary frustration. "The road is washed out. The bridge at Miller's Creek is probably flooded. It could be a day. It could be 3. Until then, you're my guest." She said the word guest with a heavy, ironic weight. She turned away from him, breaking the tension, and went back to the pot on the stove. She ladled a thick, fragrant soup into a clay bowl. "You need to eat something. And drink some water. You're dehydrated." She set the bowl of soup and a glass of water on a small crate next to him. It was a simple, hearty-looking vegetable soup. The kind of food he hadn't eaten since he was a child. He looked at it with contempt. "I'm not hungry." "You will be," she said, not looking at him. She took a bowl for herself and sat in the worn armchair, cradling it in her hands, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold fury still radiating from him. He lay there, stewing in a potent cocktail of pain, frustration, and a deeply unfamiliar sense of powerlessness. He was trapped. He was injured. He was at the mercy of a woman who was utterly unimpressed by him. A woman who had saved his life and then, in the same breath, dismissed his entire worldview. He wanted to hate her. It would be so much easier to hate her. He tried to summon the cold, dismissive anger that had served him so well for so long. But underneath it, a different feeling festered. It was the memory of her eyes when she found him. The sincerity. The shock on his own part, not of the crash, but of being found. He had engineered his own magnificent, solitary end, and this woman, this painter in her cluttered shack, had intruded. She had refused to let him go. And now she refused to be bought. The arrogance was a fragile shell, and he knew it. He was resisting her, yes, but what he was truly resisting was the terrifying implication of her actions. That a stranger's life could have value beyond a price tag. That connection could be selfless. That he, Julian Croft, a man who had intentionally driven off a cliff, might be worthy of being saved. It was a thought so foreign and so threatening to the tomb he had built around his heart that he couldn't bear it. He closed his eyes, pretending to sleep, but he was acutely aware of her presence. The soft sounds of her eating her soup, the rustle of her sweater, the faint scent of lavender and paint. Each small detail was a crack in his armor. He had come here to die, to end everything. But the woman who saved him was now forcing him, with her quiet, stubborn compassion, to face something far more terrifying, the possibility of beginning. The next 24 hours unfolded with the slow, deliberate pace of a dripping faucet. For Julian, it was a unique form of torture. Time, for him, was a commodity, measured in billable hours, market fluctuations, and flight schedules. It was something to be conquered, optimized, and bent to his will. Here, in Lena's cottage, time was governed by the rising and setting of a sun he couldn't see through the thick storm clouds, the slow burn of logs in the stove, and the rhythm of his own throbbing leg. He spent most of that first day on the makeshift bed of cushions and blankets she had arranged for him by the fire. He remained stubbornly silent, a thundercloud of resentment and pain. He refused the soup she offered him again for lunch, a childish act of defiance that left him with a gnawing emptiness in his stomach. He was attempting to build a wall of ice around himself, to make his presence so unpleasant that she would regret her act of charity. Lena, for her part, seemed to have an endless reservoir of patience. She didn't press him, didn't coddle him, didn't rise to his silent provocations. She simply existed. She moved about her small home with a quiet, purposeful grace, her world continuing on its axis, his disruptive presence merely a temporary anomaly. She refilled his water glass without a word. She stoked the fire when it burned low. She sat by the window, sketching in a charcoal pad, her focus absolute, the soft scratch of the charcoal on paper a constant, rhythmic sound. The cottage, which had at first felt claustrophobic to Julian, began to reveal its character in the long hours of silence. It was a space that was deeply and authentically her. Every object had a story. A collection of sea-smoothed stones on the windowsill. A row of mismatched mugs hanging from hooks. Books stacked precariously on every flat surface. Poetry, art history, novels with cracked spines. And the paintings. His eyes were drawn to them again and again. They were not pretty landscapes. They were raw, emotional, and turbulent, much like the storm outside. A canvas near the door depicted a single, twisted tree, its roots exposed, clinging desperately to a crumbling cliff edge. It was a portrait of brutal, beautiful survival. It made him feel uncomfortably seen. By late afternoon, the storm had lessened its fury, settling into a steady, grey drizzle. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken things. Julian's bravado was being eroded by a combination of hunger, pain, and a profound, nerve-shredding boredom. He was a man accustomed to constant stimulation, to a flood of information and demands on his attention. Here, there was nothing. Nothing but the fire, the rain, and the quiet woman sketching by the window. He was left alone with the one thing he had spent his entire life running from, his own thoughts. The ghosts came out to play. The memory of the crash, the screech of metal, the moment of impact he had so craved. But it was no longer a clean memory. It was now interwoven with the image of her face, her eyes wide with concern, her voice cutting through his self-imposed darkness. The narrative of his grand, nihilistic end was contaminated. He finally broke the silence, his voice rusty from disuse. "The painting," he said, nodding towards the canvas of the twisted tree. "It's aggressive." Lena looked up from a sketchbook, surprised he had spoken. She followed his gaze to the painting. A small smile played on her lips. "I painted that a few months after I moved here. I felt a certain kinship with it." With a tree. The skepticism was automatic. With its stubbornness, she clarified, setting her sketchbook aside. It's refusal to let go, even when the ground is crumbling beneath it. I find that more interesting than a tree that has everything it needs. The statement hung in the air between them. An unintentional parallel, yet it landed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He was the man who had everything, and he had tried to let go. This tree, with nothing, held on. It looks like it's in pain, he observed, his voice softer now. Or it's fighting, she countered gently. It depends on what you choose to see. The conversation lapsed back into silence, but the quality of it had changed. The icy wall of his resistance had a hairline crack in it. He was still his arrogant self, but a sliver of curiosity had pushed through. Later, as darkness began to fall again, Lena reheated the soup. The savory aroma filled the cottage, and this time, Julian's hunger was a roaring beast he could no longer ignore. When she brought the bowl to him, he didn't refuse it. He took it, the clay warm in his hands, and ate. The soup was simple and delicious. Carrots, potatoes, onions, herbs he couldn't name. It was nourishing in a way that the artfully constructed, ridiculously expensive meals he was used to had never been. It was food that was meant to sustain, not to impress. As he ate, he felt a measure of his strength return, and with it, a grudging acknowledgement of his complete and utter dependency on this woman. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. He handed her the empty bowl. She took it, her expression unreadable. "You're welcome." She washed the dishes in a basin with water she'd heated on the stove. The simple, domestic act was mesmerizing to him. In his world, tasks like this were invisible, handled by a paid, unseen staff. His life was frictionless, sterile. Here, life was a series of small, deliberate efforts. Chopping wood for the fire, hauling water, tending to a wounded stranger. "Why do you live like this?" he asked, the question breaking the quiet rhythm of her work. So far from everything. She finished washing the last bowl before she answered, drying her hands on a towel. She turned to face him, leaning back against the small wooden counter. "And why do you live like you do? Surrounded by everything and everyone, but completely alone." It was a direct hit. Not an accusation, but a simple, devastating observation. It was the truth he had tried to drive off a cliff. He had no defense against it. "You don't know anything about me," he deflected, his voice low. "I know I pulled you from a car that you drove off a cliff on purpose," she said, her voice devoid of judgment, stating it as a fact. "I know you were wearing a suit that probably costs more than this cottage, and there wasn't a single picture in your wallet. Not one sign that there was anyone you were afraid of leaving behind. And I know that when you woke up, your first instinct was to try and pay me off, because that's the only way you know how to connect with another person. So, maybe I don't know anything," she paused, her hazel eyes meeting his. "Or maybe I know the only things that matter." Julian felt stripped bare. It was as if she had peeled back the layers of his wealth, his power, his cynicism, and looked directly at the hollow core he had guarded for so long. He had spent years ensuring no one could get close enough to see him. This stranger had seen it all in less than a day. He wanted to lash out, to hurt her with words, to put her back in her place. But the energy wasn't there. All he felt was a profound, soul-crushing weariness. The fight was gone. There was a picture, he heard himself say, the words a quiet admission he hadn't intended to make. "In my wallet." Lena's expression softened. The quiet warrior was replaced by the compassionate woman from the wreck. She knew she had pushed too far, but she also knew it was necessary. She walked over and sat in the armchair near him, creating a space of fragile truce. "Tell me about it." He shook his head, turning his face toward the fire. "No." "Okay," she said softly. "You don't have to." And that was it. She didn't press. She didn't pry. She let him keep that last, final wall intact. Her acceptance of his boundary was, in its own way, more disarming than her accusations. It was a gesture of respect for his pain, even if she didn't know its source. They sat in silence for a long time after that, the unspoken truths filling the space between them. The forced proximity of the storm had done its work. It had stripped him of his power, his defenses, and his ability to run. He was trapped in a room with his rescuer, a woman who saw him not as a millionaire to be feared or flattered, but as a man in pain. He was beginning to realize he was also trapped with himself, and that was the most terrifying proximity of all. The walls of the cottage were no longer just holding the storm out. They were holding him in, forcing a reckoning that was long overdue. And for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to escape. Lena believes that seeing someone's pain is more important than knowing the details of their life. Do you agree? Is it possible to truly know someone without knowing their story? Share your perspective in the comments. Sometime in the deep, quiet hours of the second night, Julian's defenses, already weakened, finally crumbled under the assault of fever. His leg, which had been a source of constant, dull agony, began to radiate a fierce, pulsing heat. A cold sweat beaded on his forehead, and a tremor ran through his body that had nothing to do with the chill outside. Lena, dozing fitfully in the armchair, was woken by a sound. A low murmur. She sat up, instantly alert, her senses honed by the quiet of her surroundings. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting the cottage in a deep, shadowy orange. Julian was thrashing in his sleep, his hands clenching and unclenching the blanket. "No, please don't," he muttered, his voice thick with a dream-state terror. His face, illuminated by the firelight, was a mask of anguish. Lena was by his side in an instant, placing a cool hand on his forehead. He was burning up. The wound in his leg must be infected. A new, more urgent fear seized her. She was isolated, without access to medicine beyond her small first-aid kit, and he was getting worse. "Julian," she said softly, trying to rouse him from the nightmare. "Julian, wake up." He didn't wake. He sank deeper into the fever dream, his words becoming clearer, more desperate. "I'm sorry, Anna. I'm so sorry. I should have been there." Anna. The name hung in the silent cottage, a ghost-given voice. It was spoken with a tone of such profound, gut-wrenching grief that it made Lena's own heart ache in sympathy. This was the source. This was the wound beneath the wound. "It's my fault," he whispered, his eyes still closed, a single tear tracing a path from the corner of his eye into his temple. "The car, always the car. Lily. Lily. Another name. Another ghost." He writhed slightly, his hand reaching out as if grasping for something that wasn't there. "Daddy's here, sweetie. Daddy's got you." Lena felt like an intruder, a reluctant witness to the raw, undiluted suffering that Julian had kept locked away. This wasn't the cold, arrogant tycoon from the day before. This was a man drowning in a sea of guilt and loss. The puzzle of his self-destruction was beginning to form a coherent, heartbreaking picture. Anna and Lily. A wife and a daughter, she presumed. Something had happened to them. Something involving a car. She spent the rest of the night tending to him, bathing his forehead with cool water, trying to keep the fever from climbing higher. He drifted in and out of these feverish confessions, murmuring names and fractured phrases that painted a tragic scene. He spoke of a business trip he shouldn't have taken, of a phone call he missed, of a rain-slicked road, and a promise to be home for a birthday party. Each word was a piece of shrapnel from an explosion that had happened 5 years ago, an event that had left him emotionally dead. As dawn approached, the fever finally broke. Julian fell into a deep, exhausted, and blessedly quiet sleep. The grey morning light filtered through the windows, revealing the toll the night had taken on both of them. Lena was pale with fatigue, her body aching from her vigil. Julian looked utterly spent, but peaceful for the first time, the anguish temporarily smoothed from his features. She knew she needed to find something to fight the infection. She had a small stock of herbal remedies, echinacea for immunity, willow bark for fever, but she needed to properly clean and redress the wound. She looked at his discarded suit jacket, lying in a heap where she'd cut it from him. It was ruined, but his wallet was probably still inside. Perhaps there was some form of identification, an emergency contact. Not that she could call them, but it felt like something she should know. She picked up the jacket. It was made of a ridiculously fine wool, now stained with mud and blood. The weight of it spoke of its quality. She found the wallet in the inside pocket. It was slim, made of expensive black leather, cool to the touch. She hesitated, a feeling of violation prickling her skin. But the memory of his feverish cries pushed her on. She opened it. The contents were sparse, clinical. A black credit card, made of some sort of metal. A driver's license confirming his name, Julian Croft, and an address in the city that meant nothing to her. A few high-denomination bills. It was the wallet of a man who didn't need to carry much. A man for whom doors simply opened. Then she saw it. Tucked away in a hidden flap behind the credit card's slot was a folded, worn piece of paper. It wasn't a crisp bill or a business card. It was soft, creased from years of being carried. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. It was a photograph. The picture was faded, its corners soft with wear. It showed the man sleeping on her floor, but a different version of him. Younger, his face relaxed, a genuine, unguarded smile lighting up his eyes. His arm was around a woman with a cascade of dark, curly hair and a laugh that seemed to fill the frame. Anna. It had to be. And sitting on Julian's lap, her tiny hands holding onto his shirt, was a little girl of about 4 or 5, with bright, curious eyes and a sprinkling of freckles across her nose. Lily. She was wearing a small silver bracelet on her wrist, a tiny charm dangling from it. Lena's breath caught in her throat. This was the family from the fever dream. This was the life he had lost. This was the source of the ghosts that haunted his eyes. The photograph completely contradicted the heartless facade he presented to the world. That man in the picture was capable of immense love and joy. The man on her floor was what was left after it had all been stolen from him. Her gaze fell on Julian, sleeping soundly now. The anger she had felt at his arrogance melted away, replaced by a wave of profound, aching compassion. He wasn't just a rich jerk who thought money could solve everything. He was a husband and a father who had lost his entire world. His cynicism wasn't a philosophy, it was a scar, a fortress built on a foundation of unimaginable pain. She carefully folded the photograph and slipped it back into the wallet, placing it on the small table beside him. The discovery had changed everything. The mystery of why he had driven off that cliff was solved. But a new, more complicated mystery had taken its place. What was she supposed to do with this knowledge? How could she help a man who was so determined to punish himself? As she stood there, watching him sleep, Whistler, her ginger cat, who had been cautiously hiding since Julian's arrival, padded silently into the room. He sniffed the air, then, to Lena's astonishment, he leaped lightly onto the blankets near Julian's feet, circled once, and curled up, beginning to purr. Lena looked at the scene. The broken man, the loyal animal, the devastating secret she now held, and felt the emotional tectonic plates of her own life shift. She had chosen this solitude to protect herself from the messiness of other people's lives, from the pain of connection and loss. But now, that messiness was here, sleeping on her floor, and her heart, which she had so carefully guarded, was breaking for him. The connection she felt to him was no longer just that of a rescuer to a victim. It was deeper, more dangerous. She saw the man he had been in that photograph, and a quiet, impossible question began to form in her mind. Could that man ever exist again? Julian woke to the gentle weight of something warm on his legs, and the low, resonant thrum of a purr. He opened his eyes slowly, his mind feeling clearer and calmer than it had since the crash. The fever was gone, leaving behind a clean, sharp exhaustion. He looked down and saw the ginger cat, Whistler, curled into a perfect orange comma on his blanket, radiating a surprising amount of heat. The sight was so unexpected, so contrary to the harsh landscape of his life, that he almost smiled. He turned his head and saw Lena sitting in the armchair, watching him. There was a new softness in her expression, a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. The guarded, challenging look was gone, replaced by a quiet, knowing sorrow. It made him feel vulnerable in a way her anger never had. "The fever broke," she said, her voice soft. "How do you feel?" "Like I was run over by a truck," he answered honestly, his own voice raspy. Then backed over for good measure. "Close," she said with a hint of a smile. "You drove a supercar off a cliff. Details matter." A ghost of a chuckle escaped him, a dry, rusty sound. "Right. Details." He noticed his wallet on the small table beside him, next to a fresh glass of water. He knew, with a sudden gut-level certainty, that she had looked inside. He knew she had seen the photograph. He felt a flash of the old defensive anger, a violation of his last sanctuary, but it was fleeting, quickly extinguished by the profound weariness that settled in his bones. What was the point of guarding a tomb? "Your cat seems to have adopted me," he said, changing the subject, stroking Whistler's soft fur with one finger. The cat stretched and purred louder. "He's a good judge of character," Lena replied, her words carrying a gentle, ambiguous weight. "He must have decided you're not a threat anymore." The implication was clear. She saw past the armor. She had seen the raw grief he'd revealed in his feverish state. The pretense between them was gone, shattered by the intimacy of his unconscious confession. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like a relief. The burden of maintaining the facade was heavier than he had ever realized. For the first time, he met her gaze without cynicism, without a shield. "I'm sorry," he said, the words costing him, but necessary. "For how I acted. For the things I said. The money." Lena gave a small nod, accepting the apology. "You were in pain. And you were scared." "I wasn't scared," he corrected her automatically, the old pride flaring. Then he paused, considering it. "No, that's not true. I was. He looked away, at the fire she had rebuilt in the hearth. I wasn't scared of dying. I was scared of you saving me. It was the most honest thing he had said to another human being in 5 years. Lena let the confession settle in the quiet room. She didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. She simply gave him the space to let the truth breathe. After a moment, she stood up. I'm going to make some breakfast. You need to eat. This time, it wasn't an order, but an invitation. A simple act of care. He watched her move around the small kitchen area, her motions fluid and familiar. He watched as she cracked eggs into a bowl, her focus entirely on the task. A fragile peace began to settle over him. The storm outside had passed, leaving a world washed clean, the air crisp and clear. Inside the cottage, a different kind of storm was beginning to subside. She brought him a plate of scrambled eggs and a piece of toast, along with a mug of strong, hot tea. He ate slowly, savoring the simple, real flavors. The food was more than sustenance. It was an anchor to the present moment, to this small, warm room. When he was done, she took the plate and then surprised him by bringing over one of her sketchbooks and a piece of charcoal. What's this for? He asked. You're bored, she said simply. You're a man who solves problems. So solve one. She pointed the charcoal at his bandaged leg. Draw your pain. Don't think about it, just draw what it feels like. The suggestion was so bizarre, so outside the realm of his experience, that he almost laughed. Him draw? He dealt in numbers, contracts, and calculated risks. But he looked at the blank page, then at his leg, and for some reason, he took the charcoal. His first few lines were stiff, awkward. He tried to draw the shape of his leg, a literal representation. No, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Not what it looks like. What it feels like. He closed his eyes, focusing on the deep, throbbing ache, the sharp, fiery jolts of nerve pain. He put the charcoal to the paper and just moved his hand. He drew jagged, aggressive lines, dark, heavy scribbles, sharp, splintering shapes. He drew a chaotic knot of energy, a black hole of sensation. He poured the physical agony onto the page without thought, without artifice. When he was done, he was breathing heavily, his forehead damp with sweat. He opened his eyes and looked at what he'd done. It was a mess of black, angry marks. But it was true. There, she said, looking at the sketch. She didn't praise it or critique it. She simply acknowledged it. Now it's on the paper. It's not all inside you anymore. He looked from the drawing to her face, and a profound, unspoken understanding passed between them. She wasn't just talking about his leg. Later that day, he felt strong enough to limp to the armchair with her help. Sitting upright, the world felt a little more normal. He looked around the cottage, his eyes now open to its strange beauty. He began to ask about her paintings, not with the detached air of a potential buyer, but with genuine curiosity. This one, he said, pointing to a canvas that was a swirl of deep blues and brilliant, explosive yellows. What is it? That's the feeling of hearing a piece of music that breaks your heart and mends it at the same time, she explained. He stared at it, trying to see what she saw. He, who had always seen art as a commodity, an asset to be acquired and displayed, was suddenly confronted with it as a language of emotion. She told him about her life, about growing up in a family that valued propriety over passion, about her escape to the coast to find a place where she could breathe. She spoke of her own loneliness, not as a source of shame, but as a quiet companion she had learned to live with. As she talked, he saw her not as some provincial eccentric, but as a woman of incredible strength and conviction, a person who had consciously chosen authenticity over comfort. In turn, he found himself speaking. He didn't unload the whole, terrible story of the accident. He didn't have to. She already knew the shape of it. But he shared a piece of it. A memory. Lily, my daughter, he began, the name feeling like glass in his mouth. She loved the rain. She would stand at the window and trace the paths of the raindrops, giving them names, imagining they were racing each other. Lena listened, her gaze soft and unwavering. The day of her birthday. It was raining, he continued, his voice thick. I was on a business trip, closing a deal. The most important deal of my career, I thought. I promised I'd be home. I was late. They went to pick up the cake without me. He stopped, unable to continue. The silence was filled with the weight of his unspoken guilt. You can't live your life in that one moment, Julian, Lena said, her voice a lifeline. You can't stay in that car with them forever. How can I not? He whispered, the question a raw plea. It was my job to protect them. And what would they want for you now? She asked gently. For you to join them? Or for you to find a way to live again? Her question hit him with the force of a physical blow because he had never, not once, considered it from that perspective. His grief had been a purely selfish thing, a monument to his own pain and guilt. He had never thought about what Anna or Lily would have wanted. The bond between them, forged in the violence of the crash and tempered by the forced intimacy of the cottage, solidified into something real and tangible. It was a connection built not on shared pleasantries, but on shared wounds. They were two solitary people who had found an unexpected harbor in each other's presence. That evening, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a spectacular display of orange and pink across the sky, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the light change. The air was calm. The world was quiet. For the first time in 5 years, Julian felt a flicker of something he had thought was lost to him forever. A fragile, tentative sense of peace. He looked over at Lena, who was watching the sunset with a serene expression, and he realized he wasn't thinking about his empty penthouse, his billion-dollar company, or his scheduled flights. He was thinking that he didn't want this moment to end. He was thinking that the warmth in this small, cluttered cottage felt more real than all the wealth in his world. Healing didn't seem impossible anymore. It felt like it had already begun. The third morning dawned bright and clear. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the air smelled of salt and clean, damp earth. It was as if the world had been reborn. Julian woke feeling a corresponding lightness in his own spirit. The pain in his leg was a dull, manageable ache, and the heavy shroud of his grief felt, for the first time, not gone, but thinner. He could breathe around it. He and Lena fell into a comfortable, easy rhythm. She made them coffee, and they sat at a small, paint-splattered table, a luxury his leg had not afforded him until now. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Whistler the cat hopped onto Julian's lap, a now familiar comfort. Julian found himself telling her about his childhood, about a love for building model airplanes that had been stamped out by his father's insistence on a more practical path. Lena, in turn, showed him the first painting she had ever been proud of, a small, intense portrait of her grandmother that had scandalized her parents. They laughed. It was a real, unforced sound that felt miraculous in the small cottage. For a few hours, they weren't a broken tycoon and his reclusive savior. They were just two people, sharing stories, finding common ground in the landscapes of their pasts. The connection between them felt solid, a tangible thing they had built together in the crucible of the storm. It felt safe. Around mid-morning, a new sound intruded on their peaceful world. A low, rhythmic thwomp-thwomp-thwomp that grew steadily louder. It was a sound that didn't belong here, a mechanical heartbeat imposed on the natural world. Lena went to the window, her brow furrowed. What is that? Julian knew the sound instantly. It was the sound of his world. Of power, of money, of brute force solutions. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. It's a helicopter. They went outside. Julian, leaning on a sturdy piece of driftwood Lena had found for him to use as a crutch. The helicopter, a sleek, black machine with the Croft Enterprises logo emblazoned on its side, was descending with terrifying precision, its rotor wash whipping the long grasses and sending Whistler scurrying back inside. It landed in the small, flat clearing 100 yards from the cottage, a monstrous, invasive insect in Lena's wild garden. The side door slid open and two figures emerged, ducking under the slowing blades. The first was Gerard, his right-hand man, looking deeply out of place in his pristine Italian suit and shiny leather shoes, which were already sinking into the soft earth. The second was a sharp-faced woman in a severe pantsuit, a woman Julian recognized as Martha Valles, the head of his legal team. They strode toward the cottage, their expressions a mixture of relief and severe disapproval. Their eyes swept over the humble dwelling, the unruly landscape, and finally, over Lena, as if she were a curious and potentially hazardous piece of local fauna. Julian, my God, we thought you were dead, Gerard exclaimed, his voice a little too loud, a little too performative. He rushed forward, but stopped short of an embrace, clearly unsure how to handle Julian's disheveled state and makeshift crutch. The tracking signal on the Veyron went dead 2 days ago, Martha said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. We've had search teams combing the coast. When the storm broke, we initiated an aerial search. Her eyes flickered to Lena, cold and assessing. It seems you've been detained. The word detained landed like a stone. It framed Lena not as a rescuer, but as a captor. Julian felt a surge of anger. She saved my life, Martha. Of course, Martha said smoothly, though her eyes suggested she didn't believe it for a second. And we are, naturally, very grateful. She gave Lena a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ms. Petrova," Lena supplied, her voice quiet but firm. She stood her ground, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of apprehension and defiance. She could feel the atmosphere shifting, the fragile piece of her world being shattered by these cold, polished invaders. "Ms. Petrova," Martha continued, "we'll need a full statement from you, of course, for insurance purposes. And naturally, Croft Enterprises will compensate you for your time and any expenses you may have incurred." She made it sound like a hotel bill. It was the same transactional coldness Julian had used, but hearing it from someone else, directed at Lena, made him sick. "I don't want any compensation," Lena said, her voice tight. Gerard let out a nervous little laugh. "Nonsense. Julian, we need to get you to a hospital. We have a top orthopedic surgeon on standby, and we have to do damage control. The media hasn't gotten wind of this yet, but it's only a matter of time. A single car accident in a Veyron? They'll have a field day. Everything was happening too fast. The language of his old life, damage control, surgeons on standby, insurance statements, was flooding back in, drowning out the quiet, authentic world he had just begun to inhabit. He was being pulled back into the machine. "Gerard, just slow down," Julian said, feeling overwhelmed. But Gerard was in full crisis management mode. He turned to Lena. "Ms. Petrova, if you could just give us a moment with Mr. Croft. We have urgent business to discuss." It was a polite dismissal, but a dismissal all the same. Lena looked at Julian, her eyes searching his, pleading with him to say something, to stop this, to defend the space they had created. She was looking for the man who had drawn his pain on a piece of paper, the man who had shared a memory of his daughter. But the Julian who met her gaze was faltering. The pressure was immense. The habits of a lifetime were reasserting themselves. He was Julian Croft, the CEO, the man in charge. This was his world, his people. They operated on his orders. He was slipping back into the role, the armor reforming around him. "It's okay, Lena," he said, his voice strained. "Just give us a minute." It was the wrong thing to say. It was a capitulation. He had chosen them over her. He had sided with the invaders. The light in Lena's eyes died. A look of profound, devastating disappointment washed over her face. She looked at him as if he were a complete stranger. Without another word, she turned and walked back into her cottage, the door closing softly behind her, but it felt like a slam. The shatter point, the bond, so carefully, fragilely built, was broken. "Right," Martha said, her focus already moved on. "Julian, we need to get ahead of this. We'll need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement with the woman." "Eh, what?" Julian stared at her, horrified. "She saved my life. And she's a potential liability," Martha countered, her voice like ice. "A reclusive artist living in a shack finds a famous, grieving billionaire who conveniently crashes on her doorstep? The tabloids will paint her as a gold-digging opportunist or a Florence Nightingale. Either way, it's a narrative we can't control. We need her silence. We'll pay her, of course. A generous settlement. She'll sign." "She won't," Julian said, his voice hollow. He knew Lena. He knew her pride, her integrity. The suggestion was a grotesque insult to everything she was. "Everyone has a price, Julian," Gerard chirped, parroting the mantra of their world. "We'll handle it. The important thing is to get you out of here and back to civilization." Julian stood there, leaning on his driftwood crutch, caught between two worlds. He could see the cottage door, closed to him now. Behind it was a world of warmth, authenticity, and a connection he had just begun to believe was possible. In front of him were his people, his empire, a world of cold logic, transactional relationships, and damage control. He had a choice to make. He could tell them to leave. He could walk back to that door, apologize, and fight for what he had found. But the gravitational pull of his old life was too strong. The weight of his identity as Julian Croft, the powerful, decisive leader, was crushing the vulnerable man who had emerged in the storm's aftermath. He was reverting to form, the muscle memory of command taking over. He felt weak, cowardly. "Fine," he heard himself say, the word of betrayal. "Handle it. Let's go." He let them guide him toward the helicopter, every step away from the cottage an act of self-destruction. He didn't look back. He couldn't bear to. He knew what he would see. A small, brave cottage standing against the vastness of the sea, a fortress of integrity he had just willingly abandoned. As he was helped into the luxurious leather seat of the helicopter, he caught a glimpse of Lena through the cottage window. She was standing by her easel, her back to him, perfectly still. She wasn't watching him leave. She had already dismissed him from her world. The blades spun faster, the noise becoming a deafening roar. The helicopter lifted off the ground, and the cottage shrank beneath him. The whole beautiful, rugged coastline spread out below. He saw the gash in the cliff where he had tried to end his life. And he saw the small, warm light of the cottage where his life had been saved, where it had been offered a new beginning. He had just thrown it all away. He had let them misunderstand her, insult her, and he hadn't said a word to defend her. He had seen the hurt in her eyes, and had chosen the easy path. He had chosen his gilded cage. As the helicopter banked and turned back toward the city, Julian Croft, a man who had survived a fall from a cliff, felt a different kind of fall. A fall from grace. This was the lowest point. Not the crash, not the grief, but this moment of profound, sickening self-loathing. He hadn't just left Lena, he had betrayed the better version of himself she had shown him was possible. And the silence in the roaring helicopter was more desolate than any silence he had ever known. The penthouse was exactly as he had left it. Silent, sterile, and suffocating. The chrome and marble gleamed under the recessed lighting, reflecting a distorted, fractured image of the man who now moved through the space. The best doctors had tended to him. His leg was in a state-of-the-art cast, and his physical recovery was assured. But as he stood once again before the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the city's indifferent grid of lights, he felt more broken than he had in the wreckage of his car. The silence was different now. Before, it had been a familiar emptiness, a void he had cultivated. Now, it was an active, crushing presence, filled with the ghosts of what he had just lost. The memory of a crackling fire, the scent of turpentine and wood smoke, the sound of Lena's quiet laughter. These things haunted the cavernous rooms of his apartment, highlighting its profound lack of life. He had returned to his kingdom, but now he could see it for what it truly was, a beautifully furnished tomb. Gerard had reported back, his voice using a smug satisfaction that turned Julian's stomach. "It's handled," he'd said over the phone. Martha presented Ms. Petrova with the NDA and a cashier's check for $250,000. Very generous. And, Julian had asked, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles were white. And she took one look at it, laughed, a very strange, sad kind of laugh, and then she tore the check in half and handed it back to Martha, Gerard recounted, bewildered. Said her integrity wasn't for sale. Then she tore up the NDA and used the pieces as kindling for her stove. Can you believe the nerve? Julian could. He could picture the scene perfectly. Lena's quiet strength, her utter refusal to be diminished or bought. The thought filled him with a strange, painful mix of pride and shame. "We'll have to take further legal action, of course," Gerard had continued, to ensure her silence. "No," Julian had interrupted, his voice cold and final. "You will do nothing. You will not contact her again. You will not go near her. Leave her alone. Is that understood?" The ensuing silence on Gerard's end was a satisfying mix of shock and fear. Julian had hung up without another word. He was alone now. Truly alone, with his decision. The choice he had made at the cottage replayed in his mind on an endless, torturous loop. He had let his title, his reputation, his machine, steamroll the one authentic connection he had made in years. He had reverted to the cold, calculating man he thought he was, only to discover that man was no longer a perfect fit. Lena had shown him the cracks in his armor, and now that he was back in it, it chafed and cut at him. He limped through his silent apartment, his crutch echoing on the marble floors. He passed the bar, with its rows of expensive, unopened bottles. He passed the pristine kitchen, where no one ever cooked. He ended up in his office, in front of the single-framed photograph of Anna and Lily. He picked it up, his thumb tracing the outline of his daughter's smiling face. He remembered what Lena had asked him. What would they want for you now? For 5 years, he had honored their memory with a living death, a mausoleum of guilt. He had believed that suffering was his penance. But looking at their vibrant, happy faces, he realized the flaw in his logic. Their love for him had been a living, breathing thing. The greatest dishonor to their memory was not living, but choosing to stop. His suicide attempt hadn't been an act of grief. It had been an act of supreme selfishness. And Lena had been the first person to see that. She hadn't tried to fix him. She had simply made a space for him to begin to fix himself. She had offered him a different way to be, a path that wasn't about forgetting the past, but about learning to carry it with grace. And he had spat on the offer. The choice was devastatingly clear. He could stay here, in this monument to his failure, and let the silence swallow him whole. He could continue to be Julian Croft, the billionaire titan, a hollow man in a glass tower. Or he could try to be the man Lena had seen glimpses of. The man who could draw his pain. The man who could laugh. The man who was worthy of being saved. It was a choice between pride and vulnerability. Between the fortress and the cottage. Between an ending and a beginning. His resolve hardened. It was a terrifying, exhilarating feeling. He wasn't sure what he would do. He wasn't sure what he would say. He had no plan, no strategy. All he knew was that he could not stay here. He picked up his phone, but instead of calling Gerard or his pilot, he did something he hadn't done in years. He called the main switchboard for a commercial car service. He didn't want the helicopter. He didn't want the private jet. He wanted to return to her world on its own terms. Meanwhile, on the coast, Lena was trying to reclaim her life. She had scrubbed the floor where he had lain, as if trying to erase the last physical traces of his presence. She had thrown herself into her work, attacking a new canvas with a furious, chaotic energy. She was painting the helicopter, a dark, angular scar in a sky of brilliant blue. She was painting her fury, her disappointment, her heartbreak. But it was no use. His ghost was everywhere. In the armchair where she'd watched him sleep. In the empty soup bowl. In the soft purr of Whistler, who now seemed to look for him in the empty space by the fire. She had believed for a moment that he was different. She had seen the profound grief and vulnerability beneath the surface and had allowed herself to connect with it. She had let her guard down, let him into the sanctuary of her solitude, and even into the deeper sanctuary of her heart. And he had proven her a fool. The moment his world came calling, he had reverted, leaving her feeling naive and used. The pain of it was a physical ache, sharper than any loneliness she had felt before. She had made a mistake. She had broken her own rules. She had let the world in, and the world had broken her heart. She resolved to build her walls back up, higher and stronger this time. She would not make that mistake again. Late the next day, as she was staring out at the sea, trying to find solace in its vast, unchanging rhythm, she heard the sound of a car engine. Not the aggressive roar of a supercar, but the humble rumble of a standard sedan. It was coming slowly, carefully, up her long, winding driveway. Her heart hammered in her chest. A part of her hoped, and a part of her dreaded. She stood her ground on her small porch as the car came to a stop. The back door opened, and Julian emerged. He was not the man who had left in the helicopter. Gone was the aura of power and command. He was just a man in simple trousers and a sweater, leaning heavily on a proper medical crutch, his face pale and etched with uncertainty. He looked fragile. He looked human. He looked terrified. He dismissed the driver and began the slow, painful journey toward her, each step on the uneven ground a visible effort. He didn't stop until he was standing a few feet from her, at the bottom of her porch steps. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sound the cry of the gulls and the distant wash of the waves. Julian's grey eyes, when he finally met hers, were stripped of all artifice. There was no arrogance, no cynicism. There was only a raw, pleading vulnerability. He looked like the man she had first seen in the wreckage, a man whose soul was laid bare. "Lena," he began, his voice quiet, steady. "I have no right to be here. I have no excuse for what I did. The way I let them treat you, the way I left, it was cowardly. And it was the single greatest mistake of my life." Lena said nothing. She wrapped her arms around herself, a protective gesture, her heart a tangled knot of hope and hurt. "For 5 years," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "I've been living in a ghost story I wrote for myself. A story where I was the villain, and my only purpose was to punish myself. I thought ending my life was the final chapter. I thought that was my destiny." He took a shaky breath. "But you interrupted the story. You pulled me out of the dark, and you didn't just patch up my leg. You showed me that there was another way to be. You looked at me and saw a man worth saving, and I had forgotten that man even existed." He gestured back toward the empty driveway. "That world, the helicopter, the lawyers, it's a machine. And I've been its master for so long I forgot I had a choice. I chose the machine over you, over the one real, honest thing I've felt in years. And that choice has been eating me alive." He looked around at her small, wild garden, at the sturdy cottage, at the vast ocean behind it. "This place, this is real. My penthouse is the illusion. I spent years building an empire of glass and steel, and I've never felt as rich as I did for the 2 days I spent on your floor." Tears pricked at Lena's eyes, but she fought them back. She had to be sure. "What do you want, Julian?" He looked down at his crutch, then back at her. "I don't know," he said with breathtaking honesty. "I don't have a plan. I don't have a 5-point proposal. All I know is that being back in my world without you is unbearable. The silence is no longer empty. It's filled with your absence. He took a small, difficult step closer. I'm not asking you to fix me. I have a lot of work to do on myself. I need to learn how to live with my ghosts without letting them drive. I need to learn how to be the man my wife and daughter would be proud of. But I don't think I can do it alone. I don't want to do it alone. He echoed the words she had said to him. I'm not asking for a transaction. I'm not offering you anything but the truth. I'm broken. I'm scared. But for the first time, I want to fight. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. Lena, you showed me how to fight. Will you let me fight for this? For us? The raw sincerity of his plea dismantled her walls piece by piece. This wasn't the tycoon. This wasn't the cynic. This was the man from the photograph, a man who had been through hell and was finally, tentatively, choosing to walk toward the light. She saw his transformation, real and hard one. She saw the immense courage it took for him to come back here, stripped of his power, offering nothing but his broken, hopeful heart. Slowly, she uncrossed her arms. She walked down the 2 steps of the porch until she was standing directly in front of him. She reached out and, just as she had done in the wreckage of his car, she touched his face, her hand gentle on his cheek. It was an echo of their first connection, the moment the bomb had landed. Yes, she whispered, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. Yes, Julian, I will. A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled his knees washed over him. He reached out with his free hand, his fingers lacing with hers. The connection was instantaneous, electric, and deeply calming. It felt like coming home. He didn't know what the future held. It would be messy, complicated. His world and her world were universes apart. But for now, none of that mattered. He was here. She was here. And they had chosen each other. My leg hurts, he said, a small, wry smile touching his lips. Lena smiled back, a true, radiant smile that lit up her entire face. Good, she said, her grip on his hand tightening. It means you're still here. Together, she helped him up the steps and into the warm, vibrant, cluttered cottage. The door closed, shutting out the rest of the world. And this time, it felt not like a fortress, but like a beginning. The millionaire was meant to die in the car crash. But the woman who saved him hadn't just changed everything. She had given him everything. A second chance at life, and an unexpected, beautiful first chance at love. Julian's story is one of profound transformation, choosing vulnerability over pride. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to step away from a comfortable but empty life to chase something more real? Share your story or thoughts below, because every journey toward authenticity is worth celebrating. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.